My name is Walt Dunmore, and for 61 years my family has worked the same 140 acres off Cobble Creek Road. My grandfather cleared the first 20 acres by hand. My father added the barn, the second well, and the fence lines that still stand today. And when he passed, the farm came to me, along with every headache and every blessing that comes with keeping land alive. I want to tell you what happened when a homeowners association decided my driveway was theirs to control. It's a story about arrogance, about paperwork nobody bothered to read, and about how the past has a way of showing up right when you need it most. Growing up, I spent my summers riding on the fender of my father's tractor, learning the smell of turned soil and the sound rain makes on a tin roof at 3 in the morning when you're praying it stops before the hay gets ruined. We weren't rich, not in the way people in town measured things, but we were never hungry, and we never once doubted whose land we stood on. That kind of certainty is worth more than most people realize until somebody tries to take it from them. For most of my life, the only neighbors near the farm were fields and tree lines. Then, about 8 years ago, a developer bought the old Pruitt property next door and built Somerset Ridge, 60-some houses, a clubhouse, a swimming pool, and iron gates with a keypad. Nice enough houses, I suppose, if you like everything to look the same, with the same beige siding and the same 3 shades of approved shutter color. I never had a problem with new neighbors. Change comes to every piece of land eventually, and I've always believed a farmer ought to make peace with that rather than fight it. What mattered to me wasn't the houses. It was the road. See, my farm entrance, the gravel lane my grandfather cut into the hillside back in 1961, runs along the edge of what became the subdivision's boundary. That lane is the only way a truck, a combine, or an ambulance can get onto my property. There's a back trail through the woods, but it floods every spring and it's too narrow for anything wider than an ATV. That gravel lane is my lifeline, plain and simple. When Somerset Ridge went up, the developer's surveyors came through and marked the property lines. I remember shaking hands with the site manager, a decent fellow named Roy, who told me the lane would remain untouched since it long predated their project. He even showed me the plat map with a dotted line marking what he called existing agricultural access, and he made a point of telling me his crew had been instructed to leave a 30-foot buffer on either side of the gravel so my equipment would never be boxed in by the new curbing they planned for the neighborhood streets. He struck me as a man who did his homework, and for a while, that was enough to put my mind at ease. I even brought Roy a jar of my wife's blackberry preserves the week the subdivision broke ground, which he seemed genuinely tickled by. We talked for a good 20 minutes about drainage and how the new houses might affect runoff onto my lower field. He assured me the engineering plans accounted for it. I didn't think another thing about the road after that. I had crops to plant, cattle to feed, and a father's legacy to keep standing, and for the better part of 3 years, that's exactly what I did while Somerset Ridge filled in, lot by lot, with young families and retirees drawn in by the developer's promises of quiet country charm. The trouble didn't start with Roy. It started 3 years later, when the developer sold off the last lots and handed control of the neighborhood over to a homeowners association. That's when a woman named Deborah Castellan became HOA president, and things changed fast. Deborah was the kind of person who believed a clipboard gave her authority over the whole world. She sent letters about lawn height. She sent letters about mailbox color. And one grey October morning, she sent a letter about my driveway. The letter claimed that my gravel lane crossed onto what the HOA now called common area, and that as of the 1st of the following month, the association intended to resolve the unauthorized encroachment. I read that letter 3 times standing right there at my mailbox, coffee going cold in my other hand, trying to figure out how a lane my grandfather built before that subdivision ever existed could suddenly belong to somebody else. I called the HOA office and asked for a meeting. Deborah agreed, mostly, I think, because she wanted an audience. I walked into that clubhouse boardroom in my work boots, feeling every eye in the room measure me up like I'd tracked in more than dirt. 5 board members sat behind a long table with name placards in front of them, like they were about to hear testimony in a real courtroom instead of a converted meeting room that still smelled like chlorine from the pool next door. "Mr. Dunmore," Deborah said, folding her hands on the table like she was about to deliver bad news to a patient, "our attorney has reviewed the recorded plat for Somerset Ridge. Your access lane sits on what is now designated common area, held in trust for the homeowners. We are well within our rights to close it." "That lane has been there since 1961, I said. "Longer than this neighborhood has been a thought in anyone's head." "That may be," she said, "but possession follows the recorded plat, not local memory." I asked her, plain as I could, what she expected me to do, Drive my tractor and my grain truck through a flood-prone deer trail? She told me, without blinking, that the association wasn't in the business of accommodating outside agricultural operations, and that I should consider alternative logistics. One of the other board members, a quiet man named Herb who I later learned had voted against the whole plan, wouldn't meet my eyes the entire meeting. I noticed that. I filed it away. I asked whether the board had actually consulted the county before deciding a road that had existed for over 6 decades was suddenly theirs to close. Deborah waved the question off, saying the association's attorney had thoroughly vetted the matter and that further discussion wasn't necessary. She slid a printed copy of the subdivision plat across the table toward me, tapping a manicured finger on a shaded polygon that, according to her, swallowed up my grandfather's gravel lane entirely. I looked at that shaded polygon for a long moment and told her I'd be looking into it myself, and she smiled the kind of smile people give you when they've already decided you're wasting everyone's time. I left that meeting with my jaw tight and my mind already working. I didn't have a law degree, but I had something better, a lifetime of knowing this land, and a showbox full of papers I hadn't touched since my father's funeral. 2 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I walked down my own lane in my robe and boots and found a paving crew laying fresh asphalt clean across the entrance to my farm, right up to where my gravel began. They'd installed a raised curb along the property line, and beside it, a brand new sign, Private Road, Somerset Ridge Residents and Guests Only. My truck was parked on the wrong side of that new curb. I was, for all purposes, locked out of my own farm. I asked the foreman what in the world was going on. He shrugged and told me he was just following the work order from the HOA management company, and that he'd been told the property line dispute was already settled by the association's lawyers. I didn't blame him. A man doing his job with a paving crew isn't the one who decides who owns what. I called Deborah. She didn't answer, not that day and not the next. I called the HOA's management company, and a receptionist told me, with the flat politeness of someone reading from a script, that all inquiries needed to go through the board's attorney. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line, and a deputy came out, looked at the situation, and told me gently that this looked like a civil property dispute, not something he could resolve on the spot with a citation. He walked the length of the new curb with me, shaking his head at the sign, and admitted off the record that in 22 years on the job, he'd never seen an HOA move quite that fast to block off a road. He did, at least, write up a report and take photographs, which turned out to matter more than I could have guessed. Before he left, he told me something I've never forgotten. Mr. Dunmore, in my experience, when somebody moves this aggressively this fast, they're usually hoping you won't have the energy to fight back. Don't give them that. For the next several days, I lived a nightmare most people never have to imagine. My feed delivery truck couldn't get through and had to unload at the county road, forcing me to haul 40-pound bags across a quarter-mile of muddy field by hand. My vet, coming out for a sick calf, had to park his truck and walk in carrying his bag like a country doctor from 100 years ago. When my propane tank ran low, the delivery driver took one look at the curb and the sign and told me, apologetically, that his company's insurance wouldn't let him cross onto what was marked as private property, even to reach my own tank. During those first difficult days, an unexpected ally showed up at my gate. Her name was Malene Ochoa, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 streets into Somerset Ridge and had, as it turned out, been buying my sweet corn and tomatoes from the little honor system stand at the end of my lane for years. She'd noticed the new curb and sign going up and came to ask me directly what was happening, rather than waiting on an HOA newsletter to tell her a sanitized version. When I explained it, she was furious in a way I hadn't expected from someone I barely knew. She told me plenty of her neighbors felt uneasy about how the board operated, but most were too worried about fines and dirty looks at the pool to speak up. Malene didn't strike me as the type to worry about dirty looks. She started attending every HOA meeting after that, asking pointed questions Deborah clearly didn't appreciate, and quietly gathering names of other residents who thought the board had overstepped. I didn't know it yet, but her small rebellion would matter more than either of us guessed. Worst of all was the night my hired hand, Tobias, called me in a panic because one of our mares was foaling breech. I needed the large animal vet out immediately, and I stood at that curb in the dark with a flashlight, waving down her truck at the county road so she could carry her equipment in on foot. We saved that mare and her foal that night, but only because Tobias and I hauled buckets of hot water across a muddy field while a woman with 30 years of veterinary experience worked in the beam of a truck's headlights. I remember standing there afterward, hands shaking, and thinking that somebody was going to get hurt or something worse before this was over, and it was going to be on Deborah Castellan's conscience, not mine. That was the night I decided this wasn't a fight I could win by being reasonable at a boardroom table. I needed proof. Real proof. The kind that doesn't care about a homeowners association's attorney or a glossy plat map from 8 years ago. I went into my father's old file cabinet, the one in the back room that nobody had touched since he passed. In it, I found a folder marked Simply Road. Inside were copies of deeds going back to 1958, a handwritten letter from my grandfather to the county road commissioner, and, this is the part that changed everything, a faded county resolution from 1962 formally accepting the lane as a public right-of-way in exchange for my grandfather granting the county a small strip of land for road maintenance access. It even had an official seal and a case number. My grandfather, it turned out, had done something smarter than anyone gave him credit for. Back when the lane was cut, the county had wanted a stretch of his northern boundary to reroute drainage for the old creek crossing, and rather than fight them over it the way a lot of stubborn farmers might have, he'd struck a deal. He granted the county the strip of land they needed, and in exchange, the county formally accepted his farm lane into the road system as a dedicated right-of-way, guaranteeing it would always be maintained and always remain open, regardless of who owned the land on either side in the future. It was, in its own quiet way, a shrewd piece of foresight from a man who never finished the 8th grade but understood the value of getting a promise written down in ink rather than trusting a handshake alone. He'd told my father about it once, apparently, over dinner sometime in the 70s, but my father, focused on running the farm through some genuinely hard years, a drought in 83, a barn fire in 91, had let the memory fade with time the way a lot of old family stories do. The recorded document, though, never went anywhere. It sat in a manila folder inside a steel filing cabinet in a courthouse basement for over 60 years, untouched, unchallenged, and completely legitimate, waiting for someone to need it. I drove straight to the county courthouse the next morning with that folder held against my chest like it was made of gold. The clerk in the recorder's office pulled the original resolution from the archive, and sure enough, there it was in the county's own record book, dated November 1962, dedicating the lane as a public right-of-way for ingress, egress, and agricultural use in perpetuity. The clerk actually smiled at me and said, "Well, Mr. Dunmore, looks like somebody in your family knew what they were doing." I filed a formal petition with the county road department that same week, attaching the resolution, my grandfather's letter, the sheriff's report from the day the crew paved over my entrance, and photographs of the new curb and signage blocking a road the county itself had legally accepted 6 decades earlier. The clerk's office told me it could take several weeks to schedule a review, given how backed up their docket was, and I remember driving home that day feeling like I'd finally done something instead of just absorbing blow after blow. I also reached out to a local land use attorney named Priscilla Ahn, whose name I found through a Farm Bureau referral. She took one look at the resolution and told me plainly, "This is about as clean a right-of-way claim as I've seen in 20 years of practice." They didn't just build on questionable ground. They built on ground that was never theirs to claim in the first place. Priscilla agreed to take the case, and over the next several weeks, she helped me organize everything into a proper filing, cross-referencing the 1962 resolution against current county road maintenance records, which, as it turned out, still listed my lane under an old internal reference number nobody had bothered to update on newer maps. She also sent a formal letter to the HOA's attorney notifying them of the pending petition and requesting they cease any further work on the disputed section of road until the county rendered a decision. Word got back to Deborah fast, likely from someone on the HOA board who still had some sense left. I suspect it was Herb, though he never said so directly. She sent me a cease and desist letter through the association's attorney, warning me not to attempt to remove the curb or access the road without express written permission, and vaguely threatening legal action for trespass upon association property if I so much as drove my truck across the new asphalt. I framed that letter, honestly, because it was the last confident thing she ever sent me. A week later, an HOA newsletter went out to residents describing me, without naming me directly, as an adjacent property owner attempting to circumvent community governance standards. Marlene sent me a photo of it with 3 separate exclamation points in her text message. The county scheduled a public hearing to review the petition. I'll admit I didn't sleep much the week before. I kept thinking about all the years my family had worked that land, all the trips my father made down that lane hauling hay, and how close I'd come to losing access to it over a piece of paper somebody in a boardroom had misread, or maybe never bothered to read at all. The hearing was held in the county administration building on a Thursday evening in March. I wore my one good jacket, the one I usually save for church and funerals. Priscilla sat beside me with a folder thick as a phone book, tabbed and organized with more care than I'd seen her put into anything since we'd started working together. Deborah showed up with the HOA's attorney, a tall man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. To my surprise, the small meeting room was more crowded than I expected. Marlene had come, along with 6 or 7 other Somerset Ridge residents I didn't recognize, several of them carrying printed copies of that newsletter with the Circumvent Community Governance Standards line highlighted in yellow. Herb sat quietly in the back row, arms crossed, watching everything without saying a word. Deborah's attorney tried to argue that the right-of-way, even if valid, had been abandoned through disuse. I nearly laughed out loud at that one. I stood up when the chairman gave me the floor and told the room, calm as I could manage, that road has never gone a single week unused in 64 years. My family has driven tractors, trucks, and ambulances down it. The only reason it looked unused to anybody is because a paving crew buried it under asphalt 3 weeks ago. I brought out the sheriff's report and the photographs of the mayor's foaling, and I watched a couple of the county commissioners exchange a look that told me everything I needed to know. The board didn't take long to deliberate. They stepped out for barely 10 minutes, and I spent every one of them staring at a water stain on the ceiling tile above my head, too nervous to make conversation with anyone. When they filed back in, the chairman came back and read the decision aloud. The county recognized the 1962 resolution as valid and enforceable, declared the lane an active public right-of-way, and ordered Somerset Ridge Homeowners Association to remove any obstruction, including the curb, the signage, and the section of asphalt encroaching on the dedicated right-of-way, within 30 days, at the association's expense. Furthermore, because it was now formally reaffirmed as a public right-of-way, the road could never again be gated, curbed, or restricted by any private entity, including, the chairman noted with just the faintest trace of a smile, the very association that tried to close it. Somewhere behind me, I heard Marlene let out a quiet yes, and a few of the other residents actually applauded before the chairman gently reminded the room this was a hearing, not a ball game. Deborah's face went through about 3 different expressions in the span of 5 seconds, none of them pleasant. Her attorney closed his folder without a word and started gathering his things before the chairman had even finished speaking. I won't pretend I didn't feel something rise up in my chest hearing those words. 64 years of quiet paperwork, sitting patiently in a filing cabinet, had just outlasted every ounce of Deborah Castellan's confidence. Priscilla squeezed my shoulder and told me, under her breath, that in her whole career she'd rarely seen a right-of-way case resolved so cleanly and so fast, and that I ought to thank a stubborn old farmer who never lived to see this day for making it possible. The 30 days came and went, and true to the order, a crew showed up, paid for by the HOA special assessment, which I later heard did not sit well with several homeowners who had nothing to do with the original decision, and tore out the curb, cut back the asphalt, and restored the gravel entrance to my farm. The county went a step further and had the road properly graded and gravelled at its own expense going forward, since it was now, officially and permanently, a public right-of-way rather than my private responsibility alone. For the first time in my life, the county road department plows that lane after a snowstorm. There's a bit of poetic justice in how it all settled, too. Because the road is now a recognized public right-of-way, it means anyone can use it, not just me, but delivery drivers, hikers, hunters with permission, and, technically, any resident of Somerset Ridge who wants to walk their dog down a gravel lane that runs along a working farm. I started seeing a few of them out there most evenings within a month or two, waving as they passed my fence line, some stopping to ask about the cattle or the crops. It turns out most people, when they're not being told they can't do something, are perfectly pleasant neighbors. Deborah, from what I hear, was quietly voted off the HOA board at the next annual meeting. Marlene ran for the open seat herself and won by a wide margin, campaigning, she told me with a laugh, on nothing more than a promise to actually read the county records before threatening the neighbors. Several homeowners were furious about the legal fees and the special assessment that came out of their own pockets for a fight the board never should have picked in the first place, and from what Marlene tells me, the association's insurance premiums went up considerably the following year on account of the whole ordeal. Herb, it turned out, had voted against the paving project from the very beginning and had the meeting minutes to prove it, which came in handy when a few residents started asking hard questions about accountability. As for me, I planted a line of young oak trees along the fence by that lane last fall, the same kind my grandfather planted along the far pasture back in the 60s. My hope is that 60 years from now, some grandchild of mine will walk under those oaks and never have to wonder whether the road under their boots belongs to them. Thanks to a piece of paper my grandfather had the good sense to file away, and a county clerk who kept careful records for 6 decades, they won't have to. If there's a lesson in all this, I suppose it's that history has a way of sticking around long after people assume it's been forgotten. A homeowners association can put up all the curbs and signs it wants, but it can't erase a public record that's sitting quietly in a courthouse basement, waiting for someone to come looking. My grandfather never lived to see how much that little agreement he made in 1962 would matter, but I like to think he'd get a real kick out of knowing his handshake with the county outlasted an entire subdivision's worth of lawyers. These days, when I drive my truck down that gravel lane past the new public right-of-way, maintained by Cobble County sign the road department put up at the entrance, I always slow down just a little. Partly out of habit. Partly, I think, out of respect for a man who knew, even back then, that the best way to protect what you love isn't to fight loud. It's to make sure the truth is written down somewhere it can't be paved over.